Okay, so welcome to the Beijing evening session. I am the chair, Thomas Richardson, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ricardo Silva from University College London. Ricardo is a professor of statistical machine learning and data science at the Department of Statistical Science at University College London, and he will be talking to us today about prediction, action, and interference in algorithmic fairness. Over to you, Ricardo.
All right, I assume you can see it well. Yeah, good. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm happy to talk about this piece of work, which I did a while ago with some people from the Alan Turing Institute, which are now at very different organizations these days. So this is joint work with Matt Kuznick, Chris Russell, and Josh Loftus. So we want to think about actually designing some policy, and this policy may have different effects in different subgroups. So you want to be able to formulate some notion of impacts which don't create some sort of disparity, unfairness, or inequality as you choose your action. And in particular, you may have actions that may affect several units in your population at the same time. And part of the idea will be to formulate this explicitly when trying to make a case how your policy may actually be beneficial according to some measure of fairness. So I'll start by just putting this in a bigger context, because when you talk about algorithmic fairness, there are so many different problems that sometimes people think that problem they are dealing with is the only one that exists. But it's good to contrast at least a couple of different problems that we face in algorithmic fairness and how this relates in particular to choice of actions. So I have give an example of something we introduced here. On a fairness criteria that is formulated in terms of counterfactuals. You will do later on some experiments with simulated data that is based on real data, but you have an idea of how different choices of actions may have different impacts by knowing what the true outcome would be from the simulation study. So we have some pieces of notation here, or follow graphical notation. There will be random values in circles and intervention values in squares, and some of the values will be unobserved. They will be with these empty disks. There will be a difference between an outcome you're interested in the real world, but they'll also refer at the beginning to what some people usually target in some algorithmic fairness applications, which is the prediction that you're building out of historical data. So to make a contrast here, one usual problem that I've worked in the past is the problem of prediction. You want to build up, let's say, a classifier y hat that is good at predicting the value of some outcome y. There will be some protected attributes like demographics, such as race or gender or age, which maybe influence the real outcome, and be also using the construction of this classifier y hat. So when I think about a intervention here, that I'm just thinking in terms of designing how the classifier will be built, which values to use, which loss function to use, and so on. When I think about policies in the real world, I think about how these actions will actually change the real outcome you're interested in. Of course, when you change some sort of classifier, this will have some sort of long-term impact. But it's a problem which it itself may be a bit hard to model because effects may take a while to take place, for example. So we thought about in the past predicting, making predictions about this outcome y hat. We came up with concepts such as counterfactual fairness, which is one idea among many on how to use causal language to express what is a good desiderative for classifier y hat. Part of the idea was, if you think about this protect attribute being switched by some external intervention, it's effect to propagate among some variables in the system, but you don't want it to propagate to the classifier that you construct, which makes things a bit hard because many of the values will be affected. So part of the idea is see what you can get out, for example, of latent values which are not the causal pathway from A, to protect attribute A. And this can be a bit hard, and also is one about really creating the predictor y hat. Whatever effects this may have on y, there will only be very long-term effects which are not accounted by this framework. Now, you think about interventions, maybe think, for example, a situation like this, where you have some indicator that you like to be less biased, so to speak, according to some protect attribute. So here I had this first year average as some measure on how a student may be doing after 1 year in college. And there are many putative factors here leading to that, such as place of birth, which may lead to which school the student attends, which may lead to for first year average. And you may think that, again, this is given as an assumption, as a value judgment. This is nothing to do with the causal model itself, except as an input to a criteria that uses a causal model. So we make a value judgment that place of birth is a protected attribute. And to some extent, you want it to not be influenced the first year average anymore. So one way of thinking about this is not necessarily in terms of create a classifier for this first year average, which may lead to a part of the acceptance criteria to enroll at college or not. But you're thinking here more in terms of changing the real first year average by some intervention in the system. Some possible interventions that you're changing funding for schools, so changing school quality in a way that is independent of the place of birth, is geographically uniform, let's say, which in one sense would be directly affecting future classifiers for FY hat, because we change the real thing. So we just worry about we directly intervening in the real world system instead of a classifier. Okay, but in many cases, this type of profit intervention is idealization. So we have some sort of external actions, such as changing investment, where we are the factors affecting school quality. Of course, there are other issues that the community locally may face. So just to remind the thing, it's not really going to be able to set something perfectly. So maybe in a more abstract sense, there are some policy values that will change the distribution of these intermediate factors, but not really completely override them. So in this talk, I'm going to look at this very simplified setup. You have these actions, these Z variables here, which are the policies you're making, just affecting directly the outcome. I mean, in general, you may have some sort of mediators between A and Y. You may have actually a distributed set of Z factors which interact with mediators at different times. But here's most the bare bones thing you can think of. There are some covariates X which precede the outcome. They may precede also the protect attribute. And just think about the total effect of this A on this outcome Y as moderated by your choice of action Z. And in some cases, you may have your actions that are affecting several units at a time. Actually, the title called this interference, you should really call this spillover, because it's really about your action modifying several things at the same time. Because in some situations, you may have, for example, geographical proximity will be, in one way or another, a condition by which your action may propagate beyond the unit you're manipulating. So here, when you think about the counterfactors which are at play, you are the ones that you control, like the Z variables, and the ones which relate to the protect attribute. So you may have a counterfactor index by these two factors at the same time. So one example, let's take some classic example from the literature, is if you give incentives for people to change where they live. So as I said, place of birth or place where you live may be a factor to a first year average, so may as well think, well, or even give subsidies for people to move elsewhere. In this case, it's about really job opportunities. So a person may only not get a subsidy to move to a place with better job opportunities, but those which are not directly selected by a randomizer that say get it is or not, they may still be affected. Because if people leave their neighborhood, this may develop the neighborhood, they actually may be hurt by just this policy trying to affect a subset of an experiment of a particular target policy. All right. So you may think in these problems when they also have this kind of moderation effect between Z and A on the generation of the output Y, as having Y as a measure of quality on how well some individual is doing. So sometimes in the banded literature, called this a reward function. And this will have counterfactuals because you're thinking about not only the actions that you do, which in this case would be the entire vector Z. So here is not really assuming this kind of stable unit treatment allocation, the entire vector Z indexing the counterfactuals of the entire population. But you want to think in terms of rewards. It means you may want to design Z such that it maximizes a cumulative notion reward. Here's the summing over the expected values of each outcome. And notice here then also take into consideration a protected attribute, some attribute A, which here I'm going to imagine what happens under alternative counterfactual versions of A. So far, I'm not showing this explicitly. Here is just the same value on the right-hand side, the left-hand side is conditioning bar. So it's just by consistency, it's all the same thing anyway. And you have, of course, a budget, because many of these problems, they bottleneck that will tie things, they'll create a compromise of fairness, the fact you have a budget. So which kind of fairness considerations you can put in here? I'm not saying this is the only thing to consider. This is kind of one way by which you can think that counterfactuals in the protected attribute will interact with your policy variable Z. So in this example, I define something called counterfactual privilege. Is the idea that there is an attribution to how much you expect outcome will vary if you were to flip your protect attribute value to something different. So here I'm conditioned in the realized protect attribute, and then imagine that you benefit from that. So if you were to have an alternative A prime, maybe you would do worse. You had the privilege of belonging to that group, little AI. So this measure is how much you gain by belonging to the group that you belong as is. Now, with this notion, you may think, well, if some people are getting extra gains by just belonging to this protected group that they don't really have control of, maybe I wanted to discount people who are gaining too much from that. May think that is unfair, and again, this is a completely moral value judgment that is dependent on the application. This is not implied by the models. This is an input to the procedure. But the bottom line is at this stage, we are just agreeing that I'm taking for granted that this is not something you want, or at least want to mitigate. You want to mitigate choices of Z which will interact with the realized group that the person belongs to by not inflating outcomes or the overall sum of rewards just because of this interaction. So how this is going to boil down to an actual procedure. So what we have here is something that is giving a model. Of course, this expected value here in practice you don't have, would have be an estimated expectation. If you have uncertainty on the estimates, you can try to propagate these uncertainties either by creating directly confidence intervals in this mathematical program, or maybe just using some sort of pipeline that propagates uncertainty from these estimates into this mathematical program, as if this is just a function of a posterior distribution, for example. So this mathematical program, on top of what I described before, you're going to have a control that is so-called counterfactual privilege. Is one-sided. This case is not absolute value. You may think that some protected groups or some instances of groups should be allowed to have a privilege. Again, this is going to be problem dependent, but in general, it doesn't need to be symmetric. You may say it's not the absolute value, just the value as is. Okay, so this sets up the problem, of course, if you think of Z as a binary vector, we'll need to have an integer linear or some sort of combinatorial optimization problem to solve that, given your estimates of the expected value. Okay. Now, in terms of whether this describes a feasible problem or not, is going to depend on the nature of your policy. Because you may think, well, what if this action taken really does nothing, right? You could have a problem in which you like to control, like to have solutions. So let me go back here. I'd have solutions where this privilege is not bigger than some predefined threshold tau. It doesn't mean you'll be able to. It depends on choice of tau, but also depend on the nature of this policy action Z. If, for instance, this expected value or the outcome is a function which is additive on Z and A, it doesn't matter what to do to Z, this counterfactual privilege is not going to change. So if at the baseline Z equals 0, this privilege is already bigger than the threshold that you set, there will be no Z that is be able to find it, give you a feasible solution to this mathematical program. That's a real world property of Z. There's not going to conjure from a mathematical program that it can do that. So in one sense, it can provide, if you run this analysis, you can be able to say, well, under this setup, your policy is never going to achieve that. We either have to have a higher compromise, you can go back to the drawing board and get a different notion of action instead of this one that you put in here. So an algorithm for solving that program assumes that there is a feasible solution. In the way they set up the parametric form of the regression equation will be an integer linear program, depending on how you set up the model. But for example, you show later on. So a linear model. So this is going to be a linear model in Z2. So it's going to be a integer linear program in Z. There are ways of running ILPs that you can have a certificate of optimality. So it's not always feasible, right? There's an NP hard problem, but sometimes you're able to use something like branching bound with linear program relaxations. You get a result in which you have a certificate that is indeed a global optima. And when you have this notion of spillover, I previously defined this counterfactual as being arbitrarily indexed by the entire vector Z. In practice, we have, as I said, some geographical constraints that you say, well, there's no way this action, this individual affect this action, that individual. So we have a bounded neighborhood. If you find you have a bounded neighborhood, we'll be able to re-express your vector Z in terms of categorical variables on the overlap regions, the regions of influence of each decision that you make. So if you have one action for one individual affect a neighborhood of 5, you can think of this variable as indexing all the possible combinations of categorical policies on this set of 5, with some other constraints that make them coherent. So they actually correspond to the same vector Z of the original setup. So when we have this, you go back to integer program anyway. So even with this spillover factor, you get to some program. Sorry for the notation, which I don't have really time to explain, but its bottom line is the same linear program before, the same ILP before, but now expressed in terms of these cluster variables, okay, which are also categorical in this case. So it's still combinatorial, of course. And to give you an example on how this will be used in practice, this is synthetic data based on real data. So what is the real data? The real data are actually statistics from public schools in New York City, where you have the indicator of the majority race of students in that school. Could have proportions instead of that, but in this case, it's just an indicator out of 3 possible categories. You have some illustrative covariates, like number of full-time counselors that work at that school, but they offer these AP courses, which in the US is some sort of more advanced courses for high school students, and whether they offer calculus or not. Okay. There will be an outcome here in terms of the percentage of students in the school who actually want to go on and take the SAT, and the SAT is a test in the US for college admissions. So most colleges would require you to take that. Okay, so this is a cartoon causal model. No way I'm saying this is a realistic causal model for this problem, but this serves as illustration of the procedure. So we have here a particular school I, another school J, and here we define based on the geographical locations of these schools in New York City, whether offering calculus one school may affect what happens to another school, because you are allowed, depending on where you study, to take some special options in schools elsewhere. So you don't need just to take classes within your school. You can go to some school which is nearby, close to yours. So that's where this spillover will take place. Okay. So in this setup, the ground truth is just a model fit the data and then simulate from that. Just assume that this model is the truth. Of course, the structure may not be real, so it's just an illustration. So the intervention here exact, so I'm actually allowed to control whether or not to take the school is offered calculus or not. And this neighborhood of 5 is we made up. We just thought it would be something reasonable for this example. Okay, so under these illustrations I mentioned, in our case, you use some linear model for the expectations and for the constraints. So it boils down to a linear function Z. So this is an ILP. So the results here correspond to changes in that factor tau that I mentioned to you, which control how much counterfactual privilege you're allowing. So it can control the whole path array of it, right? I mean, it's not that people have a very strong sense of what the choice of that to be a good moral choice, but maybe at least as a way of communicating that to the stakeholders is showing how things would vary as you go from an unconstrained problem. Here's a particular value of tau that if you go beyond that, the constraint is not binding anymore. So it's the same as not having it. All the way down to more strict control. And you can see there is quite a visual impact on the distribution of the majority races that get calculus offered to them. So this is the proportions among those where Z equals 1 of the majority race of the corresponding school, and goes from having a basic all white majority schools to, in this case, majority Hispanic, when you really tight up this counterfactual privilege under the assumptions of the model. Okay, and this is just another way to see what happens to the objective function. This is the sum or the proportions of students taking the SAT as average over all the schools that you have in this domain. As increase the constraints, of course, the objective value will decrease. So as you make the constraint starting, the objective value will decrease, while change also the distribution. Okay, I have to remember here that everything is under budget assumptions, not that you can push everybody to do as well as possible, because the budget will tie them together. So ideally, like to make everybody do as well as possible, but cannot. Okay, so it's just a visualization that takes into account the actual spatial distribution of these schools. Again, just to show there is a cluster, geographic clustering to or the majority races in New York City, which again may tell you that spillover effects may be a way of boosting up a little bit your budget, because if you offer locally, it will be affecting several at the same time. But the way to find out the optimal configuration is will be by a mathematical program. Okay, so conclusion. Me and many other people have and continue to work on ways of making classifications or predictions more fair. But the thing to take into consideration is ultimately this is all pipelined in a big decision-making world, right? And if you're able to think in terms of changes to the mechanism, ways of influencing things, that this would be maybe a more plausible way of bringing fairness into the picture. So if you're able to do that, then may think about to what extent you should be encoding this problem. And causal language is fairly appropriate for that, because after all, it is about policy making. In many cases, what you have is historical data, because it doesn't really have somebody, or maybe you have a different choice of policy in the past. So whatever you're planning will be a different policy, will be out of distribution, will be a leap maybe from fully observation to an actually enacted policy. So we need a causal model for that if you're going to use historical data that feeds in this mathematical program. All right. I talked about counterfactual privilege. I'm not saying that it's the only way of thinking about that. It's just to show how this would be integrated in this problem setup. Of course, if you're a practitioner, among many other things, is not going to have a model, the true model to work with. You're going to have an estimated model. But there are many ways of thinking about how to combine mathematical programs with estimated constraints and estimated objective functions. This is not a novel problem by any chance. But also part of the input is a causal model. So maybe you wanted to see some sort of some sensitivity analysis to the extent, I mean, this comes even from classical linear programming, right? To the extent that solution of mathematical program will change if there are some changes in the constraints of objective function. In this case, that follows from the structure of the causal model. All right, so thank you very much.
Excellent. Are there any questions? So I actually have a question for you, Ricardo. So I like the way that you formulated this problem, but I have basically a fundamental question about this concept of counterfactual privilege. So I guess there are sort of two questions I have about that. One is, often with protected attributes, it's not obvious that potential outcomes such as y of a prime z, the one that you've got on the right hand side. I'm trying to think about how do we know that's well defined, and secondly, how are we going to identify that quantity, given that, you know, it's hard to think about, say, a randomized experiment where you would be randomizing A. So, I mean, yeah, maybe in your specific context, you could think about that. But yes, so I guess those are my questions. How do we know the thing on the right-hand side is well defined? And if it is well defined, how would we obtain data that would allow us to identify that quantity?
It's a very good question. I see this more as very problem dependent. So there are different ways by which, if you think about the race, right, it's very overloaded concept because it's a construct of so many moving parts. When we think about different aspects of race, people may think sometimes of perception from the part of the individual who makes a decision. So whoever looks, for example, at CV, this will be in terms of the interpretation of race according to the people who read that. In the case of this application, it's not race of an individual, right? It's the majority race of a school. So at least in principle, you can imagine that there will be bursaries or some quotas or something that could change the proportion of racial demographics in the school while keeping the same staff, while keeping the same pedagogy. I'm not saying this is ethical to do such a thing, but at least in principle, you can imagine this is physically doable while keeping the identity of the school. So this can be doable or not, depending on the domain. I mean, take a perspective here of methodology that says, if this suits what you have in mind, this is a way of approaching that. And in terms of identification, again, we could try to tap into some very crude counterfactual models as I've done in the past. That would be a crude approximation how to be able to create a counterfactual out of a parametric formulation. one thing that may be unexplored is taking into account bounds on these counterfactuals. To some extent, people have done this for counterfactual fairness, where to assess whether a classifier is counterfactual fair if bounds on the measure are within that doesn't exclude some level of fairness that you're happy with. So, because this is already a mathematical program, you may think that your objective function itself is partially identifiable. You try to find in terms of maximizing a lower bound on the reward.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, the way I was thinking about it, often one way that privilege manifests itself is that it provides you with other options that allow you to insulate yourself from policies. So that if you're in a situation where the allocation changes and you are unhappy with the result, you just say pull your children out of the system, or you. Yeah. So yes, but anyway, yeah, I think it's very interesting. So, are there any other questions? I think actually probably we're at time.